Good morning and welcome. Welcome to the 2020 Impact Festival. I'm Lígia Teixeira, the founding CEO of the Centre for Homelessness Impact, and I'm your host for today. Over a period of 5 weeks, as you probably know, the Centre for Homelessness Impact, alongside our partners and collaborators, are creating a space to meet, explore ideas, learn new skills, and build a shared sense of what we want to achieve over the next coming months and years. Today marks the end of week 3, which was dedicated to the theme All in It Together. This morning's session, titled Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, will build upon that theme by exploring how best to ensure we make informed decisions. Now, in the history of humankind, we've never had so much information, so many facts at our fingertips, and yet much of the stuff we think we know is wrong. And in homelessness, there are many myths and stereotypes that people believe. This misinformation is problematic as it further contributes to the stigmatization of a population that is already marginalized. So what on earth is going on, and how can we make informed decisions if we're not properly informed? So to help us explore these very important questions, I am thrilled to be joined today by two fantastic speakers, Bobby Duffy and Spencer Greenberg. Welcome. Thank you for making the time to be with us today. And welcome to everyone joining us online. For any questions that come up as the session goes on, you can post them into the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen, and I will put them to our two speakers towards the end of the session. The hashtag for the festival is CHI Fest 2020. So please get involved in the conversation on Twitter as well. So first, we will hear from Bobby, who is Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London. Prior to joining King's in 2018, Bobby was Managing Director of Public Affairs for Ipsos Mori, where you spent many years building out the team and the organization. Bobby also worked for the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the LSE. And his book, The Perils of Perception, and of course this is one of the key things that we're discussing this morning, is, really captures very well how some of the work that they did across the world could really challenge some of our assumptions. So welcome, Bobby. And, obviously you spent many years serving attitudes and opinions from people from at least 40 countries, and the conclusions are slightly depressing. So it'd be great for you to tell us a little bit about, where the book comes from and also what the implications are. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Should we start with the poll then, Lígia? That's, so we've got some questions for you. The best way to understand why we get things wrong, what we get wrong and why we get them wrong, is actually to ask you some questions, and then some of these questions illustrate different sorts of effects. So let's try that. This is my first time of doing my own polling on these. I usually have someone who does it for me, but I'm going to try it myself, which is very exciting for me. Let's try this. So you should have some questions coming up on your screen. Just, how many have we got? Just 5 of them. where you answer them all together. So let's just go through. So I'll read them out so that you get, so you can see them. What percentage of women and girls aged 15 to 19 in the UK give birth each year? And you got 3 options there. Is the murder rate in Britain higher, about the same, or lower than it was in 2000? Out of every 100 people aged 13 plus in India, we try to keep this nice and international, about how many have a Facebook account? And then a couple on homelessness. Of those owed a homelessness duty in England, which percent has 3 or more support needs? And of those owed a homeless duty in England, what percentage was employed, are employed? So some votes coming in. Oh, it's shifting around. I can see the results live. This is exciting. I'll give you another. We're up to 20 odd of you voting. So nearly everyone is voting. So that's great. Give another few seconds for people. Great. That should be just about everyone who's going to. End the poll. Any final answers? I'm going to end the poll now. And then I can share the results with you here. You can see those, can't you, Lydia? Yeah. So what percentage of girls aged 15 to 19 in the UK give birth each year? You, half of you have guessed 1.4%, 32% of you have guessed 5.6%, and then 16% have gone for 9%. Murder rate in Britain, you're kind of split more or less evenly across the categories, something higher, about the same, lower. And then on Facebook accounts, you got 2/3 of you thinking, half of you thinking it's 64%, and then split between the other two categories. Let's take those. Let's take those and explain what they show about our misperceptions and where they come from. So on that first one of what percentage of teenage girls give birth each year, you've done pretty well compared to the public. What you actually get when you ask the public this, the reason we got that 19% in there is because that's the average guess among the public, that 19% of teenage girls, women and girls aged 15 to 19 give birth each year, which is incredible when you think the reality is the 1.4%, that the smallest percent out of those, so 1.4% actually give birth each year. So we've got this hugely inflated view of teenage pregnancy, the commonness of teenage pregnancy, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Is the murder rate higher or lower? It's actually lower, substantially lower. So those people who said, the third of people who said lower, well done to you. On the Facebook account one, it's actually around 18 to 20% of people. So we've gone, as an audience, you've gone way too high on the percentage of Facebook account holders in India, but that's 64% was the average guess in India, which again, I'll come back to in a second. And on the homelessness ones, England has 3 or more support needs, is actually the lowest percentage there. And Lydia can correct me on this if I'm wrong, it's 14%. We got this, again, an overblown sense of the complexity of needs. And on employment, you've actually done better there. 29% is the correct answer, so half of you got it right, but still we're underestimating the extent to which employment is the norm, is more common among people with a homelessness duty in England. So let's take those three questions, and let me get rid of the poll so I can see you more directly. So that first question about teenage pregnancies, that's a classic example of what the social psychologists called emotional innumeracy, and that's basically where our reaction, our view of the world, and how we estimate how common things are in the world are much more emotional than we think they are. We think we're just assessing things rationally. But emotional innumeracy tells us that cause and effect run in both directions with our assessments of the world, that we overestimate what we worry about as much as worrying about what we overestimate. So we got this interplay between our emotional reaction, things that we're concerned about are going to literally get bigger in our minds. If we think about them more, they take up more cognitive space in our mind. And we exaggerate the scale of them. And that's really, really important for understanding both how we see the world and what you do about it. What that means is that, from my perspective, it's quite useful. When we see a big overestimate of an issue, that kind of points to the fact that people are worried about it. So if we see people overestimating teenage pregnancy, overestimating immigration levels, overestimating terrorist attacks, all of those types of things. And that's a signal that people are worried, a very direct signal. But it also means that simplistic myth busting, just telling people they're wrong, that that's the wrong figure, here's the correct figure, is never going to work in changing people's perceptions, because it misdiagnoses part of the issue, that this is an emotional reaction. This is not about a rational consideration of the facts. It's much more emotional than that. So just fighting that with facts alone, that simplistic myth busting, is not going to work, because it misdiagnoses the issue. Within that, we're also drawn to negative information more than positive information. Again, there's loads of great experiments, psychology experiments, that show that when you wire people up to brain scanning machines and you show them negative images, you get a much stronger reaction from people than you do with positive images. So we're drawn to the more negative. These vivid negative stories are the ones that stick with us most and make us inflate the scale of issues in our heads. The second question on murder rates is an example of a different effect that, again, social psychologists call rosy retrospection, where we think the past was better than it really was. And again, lots of great experiments that have shown this very literally. There's a guy called Terence Mitchell, a US professor, who followed people before, during, and then after their holidays, and when they went on vacation. And that people go in the same sort of general pattern, where we go from excited anticipation before the holiday, then when we get there, the vacation or holiday doesn't quite go to plan. Something always goes wrong, and there's a sort of slight sense of disappointment. It doesn't live up to those expectations. And then we return home, and we return home with a sense of mild disappointment that it didn't actually go to plan, on average, across lots of different people and vacations. But that wasn't the real point of his experiment. What he was doing was then following people for a long time after their vacation and holiday. And what he found was that our memory of the holidays grew more positive the longer away we got. We literally, and the mechanism was that we were literally forgetting the bad bits. So you forget the kids being sick in the car, and you just remember the lovely walks on the beach or the lovely sunsets. And that's a positive for us in some ways. We want to let go of those minor niggles from the past. But it also means that we've got a too rosy view of that past, which means that we also then can have too negative a view of the present and the future. We think things are going downhill. We've got this natural tendency to think things are going downhill. And that's why things like the murder rate, we think, is increasing. This happened across the world, not just the UK. Murder rates have been declining substantially across most countries in the last 20 or 30 years. But that's not the impression in most countries. Most people in most countries think it's increasing or staying the same, when it's actually declining quite substantially. So that sense of focusing on too negative information and thinking things are going downhill colour quite a lot of our misperceptions. Then the final effect that these questions illustrate is that Facebook in India question, where the actual rate is now about 20% of Indians, the Indian population living in India, have a Facebook account. But the average guess in India in our studies was 64%, and that's the kind of guess that you got to too. And that, in order to understand that, you need to understand that the surveys that we do are all online. All these surveys, those 40 country surveys that we've done, are all done by online surveying. So people who, by definition, have internet access. Now, that might seem like a flaw in the study, but it's actually quite useful for showing this type of effect, because those people that are taking part in these studies, they all have internet access. Their friends and family much more likely to have internet access. They're much more likely to have Facebook themselves because of that. And they generalize from their own experience and their own friends and family group to the whole of India. So they think it's much more common than it actually is. And this is another social psychology effect of that is called what we see is all there is. So we have this tendency to think that we're utterly normal, that our world is utterly normal, and then generalize from that to the rest of the country or the rest of the group that we're talking about. There's a very powerful effect, that sense of we are normal. And one of the key things to bear in mind when you're thinking about misperceptions is to really push yourself not to think that you're normal, we're not as normal as we think. You've got to not generalize from your own experience, your own perceptions, your own perspectives to the rest of the population. And those three effects, there's lots more in the book, but those three effects, very powerful together in misdirecting us. So final thing I'd say, just I know we get into discussion, Lygia, is in the book and in kind of how my thinking on this has gone is the key distinction, the key framework that I use to try to understand this very simply is that our perceptions and misperceptions are affected by two big buckets of effects. One is how we think, and that's all these biases and heuristics, these mental shortcuts that can lead us astray. But there is another bucket of effects, which is what we're told. So all of these effects are also mitigated, affected by what we see in social media, what we hear from politicians. It's what I started to talk about it's like a system of delusion. It's not one thing or the other. We're not just blaming our faulty minds and how we work, our bad maths and stats, or our biases and heuristics. And we're not blaming just how we live in a post-truth society and everyone's lying now, and social media leads us astray. It's the interaction between those two things. One feeds off the other. Politicians know that we like vivid stories, that they're the ones that stick with us. The media know that we like negative stories, that all those cliches about if it bleeds, it leads in terms of media news values are true, because that's how our brains work. They're giving us what we want in some ways. That's how we react, those emotional stories. So it's a systemic issue where you've got one feeding off the other. And there's lots of work that goes back to 1940s, 1950s America, asking some similar types of questions, which show that we were just as wrong back then in lots of respects of how we viewed the world, how we were wrong about the world, as we are now. So this isn't a unique thing to us now. We've always had these types of issues. But I do think it is more risky now because of the difference in our information environment, and because we have so much more capability to pick and choose what information we see. The filter bubbles, echo chambers are real to some degree, not as much as some people would think, but there is an element of we do get to pick and choose more of what we see. So the risks are greater. The final point is that the risks from that, I think, are not so much that we get more and more wrong about the world. It's just that we get more and more certain in our worldview, that our worldview is correct and other people's worldview is wrong. And that's where we get into the dangers from polarization and an increasingly tribal view of reality, where my side has one perspective and other people's side has a different perspective. And we don't really meet in the middle on this. It's just we get very convinced that we are correct and other people are wrong. And that's the big risk from this. I'm not really particularly worried about us getting more and more wrong about teenage pregnancy rates or murder rates or anything like that. It's more about how does it create and then reinforce tribal group identities that mean that we can't talk to each other anymore. So I'll leave it there, Lygia.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and certainly pretty much everything of what you're talking about rings true in homelessness, and obviously it's a very emotive and political issue, and fear plays a factor in how people respond, you know, whether you're affected by it, whether you're working in the field. And, you know, often people might say, oh, the media just like to put out, you know, sensationalist stories. And like you say, it's partly because the public do respond to those stories more than other types. But what we do know from the evidence we have in homelessness is that even the homelessness sector, so the experts amongst us, may be feeding the wrong types of stories for all sorts of reasons to the media as well. So when it comes to finding a way forward, a path forward, I wonder if you can think of any examples of if we can't really change how we operate as human beings, has anyone been able to work with it and find ways of educating the public that just build on what we know to be the case, rather than trying to challenge it, because it seems as if we're hardwired to behave in this way, to just notice what's unusual and all of that.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think I've done a lot of these types of discussions in the charitable sector more generally, and for NGOs, in campaigning NGOs in environment and others types of areas. And it is such a dilemma in some ways, because there's some great work that many of you will be aware of by people like Paul Slovich, academics who tested how do people react to different messages when you're campaigning or fundraising. That's been developed in great ways by lots of different practitioners themselves. And basically, Paul's work and others' work shows that pushing a sadness button is really, really effective in raising money. So having lots and lots of split sample experiments that show that in the end, having one single sad child is much more effective than using statistics, as you might expect, but it's much more effective in terms of fundraising, much more effective than even using 2 children, or kind of giving any sort of sense of a group impact to people, because we connect very much as individuals and in an emotional way with someone's individual story. But I mean, what that shows, though, is effectively you'll get most money if you do those types of very sad fundraising, very emotionally button pushing fundraising approaches. But what it also shows is effectively people are paying to not think about it. People are not really engaging in an active way. They are just giving over the money in order to say, look, I've done my bit and I don't have to think about that anymore. And it doesn't create much sense of activism and support for it in the long term. And that's a real problem, obviously, because the fundraising is really, really useful and does lots of great stuff, but it reinforces this disengagement in some people's minds, reinforces this disengagement rather than engagement with the issue. You're just reinforcing those sad messages that things are terrible and we need. Then there's no improvement. I mean, there is lots of evidence about how giving people a sense of efficacy in their support, that this is actually changing. Something works for people, that it's that sense of forward progress, that as humans, we are very keen on that sense that we can change, we can make effective change to things, and you can kind of see that a bit in the fundraising, but there's probably more that needs to be done on that, about how do you get people to engage more in that sense of creating a solution, being involved in the solution, and that's partly down to them. But it is, I don't think we have found a good, from anything I've seen, and it'd be great to hear from others if they have, I don't think we have found a way to crack that with people. How do you balance those different things for campaigning organizations who need to do that sort of fundraising? I know it's kind of a current and live issue in all of the sessions that I've done on this, and I don't think I've seen anyone come up with something that this is the solution. How do you get the benefits of that emotional connection without reinforcing stereotypes that create a disengagement in the longer term, is effectively what we're looking for. And it's a really tough thing, and it's hard to be, you could be critical of NGOs and others push those sadness messages, but it's hard to, how do you trade that off against the good that you can do with that money? It's a tough question. But no, it'd be fascinating to hear if anyone's got the answer, but I don't. I'm afraid. I wish I did have the answer. You definitely can see campaigns and approaches that are more successful than others and that do manage to do it. But that's more about execution than finding a different way, if you see what I mean.
And it seems that with other causes, somewhat very popular causes like, I don't know, fighting cancer,
Hmm.
it seems that what tends to help is if people, the public, relate to the problem, I guess, because they know someone who's been affected. With homelessness, it's a bit harder, I guess. And traditionally, it seems that our approach has been to say, oh, actually, it can happen to all of us. But reality is, when it comes to what the evidence suggests, yes, it can happen to all of us, but it's incredibly unlikely. It's much more likely if you're, poor and from a certain social background and from a certain race. All of those elements make a huge difference. So, do you think we might be being a little bit lazy? Almost. Is it sometimes about breaking habits? Because sometimes narratives develop over time. And how do we help people who are so committed almost think that it is possible to, develop new narratives? Narratives evolved over time and they can be undone. And there might be other ways of helping people understand why we are all in this together, why, having high homelessness levels in any community is bad for all of us, not just those individuals affected.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. I think that is the way to start thinking about these things. I can see why the temptation is to use a risk-based message, that because people respond to risk-based message pretty well, sometimes goes, and partly because of our tendency to inflate risks, particularly vivid risks. I mean, we've got that now, obviously, with COVID-19, with very clear in people's minds the risks, and you can see the exaggeration that people have of the extent of those risks. So people massively overestimate in our studies the chances of being hospitalized through COVID-19 because they've got this very vivid image of the hospitals are on the telly all the time, and hospitals seem to be, well, were at the time, being overrun. So people have got that sense of that. So putting the risk closer to people does seem like a way to approach this. But I agree with you that is how authentically do people feel that, and is that the right long-term message for engagement in any case? And I do think that is, I think pushing yourselves and pushing ourselves to re-engage with what is the effective narratives, how should we be thinking about this, and how should we engage with people with this? I mean, one thing that the book finishes with as its kind of very final point is the importance of deliberative methods with people, deliberative democracy in the sense of getting people involved in actual decision making, but deliberative approaches more generally, where you actually get people more time directly with people. And it kind of goes to that point about us thinking that everyone is like us or thinks like us on this, that all we see is what we see is all there is effect, is that plays out all the time, including in our research and analysis of what the issue is and what our campaign response should be. I think there are options and benefits from having that, more getting people properly involved in designing that campaign approach, and I think we still don't do it enough. It's still too light touch, still too quick focus group focused. We're talking more detailed deliberation and observational work is where a lot of these insights come from about actually how do we change that narrative and how do we engage with people in a different sort of way.
And essentially, we're talking about cultural change. And obviously, change does happen over time, change being the only constant. And yet, when it comes to social issues, it's really fascinating how easily things can go either way. You just need to look at the United States at the moment, for instance, and what's become acceptable when it comes to how they treat the most vulnerable in society can be quite shocking. And we can almost, in the UK, we can do two things. We can either say, oh, we were doing so much better, or we can also think, oh my goodness, it's a good cautionary tale of what can become really acceptable in a society. And I suppose the question for you is, what are those trigger points and what are those warning signals of a society going more towards one way rather than the other? Because even in the United States, obviously, it varies massively across the country. And what role can all of this play in those discussions?
Oh, brilliant question. I mean, I'm off this week, book writing, writing the next book on generational differences, which is looking at across different countries, including the US and UK. And that's, what that is doing is tracking generational change over time in, long-term generational change in attitudes, values, as well as behaviors. So I do think we underestimate the importance of that generational, these generational tipping points in attitudes and values. And it is, I don't think, again, I mean, it's one of those ones where I literally was writing that chapter this week on these types of values change in the US and in the UK. And when you look back to 2015, there was a lot of analysis in both the US talking about a hinge point that we're at a hinge point in a kind of cultural values, perspectives in the US, where a forward-looking, optimistic, culturally open president was just, all the indicators were pointed towards that's the way things are shifting generationally among people, more diverse, more university educated. We were getting to this these kind of cultural tipping points in the US. That was the analysis by Bill Clinton's, one of Bill Clinton's advisors. In the UK, we had exactly the same sort of thing. Jeremy Cliff did a report on Britain's cosmopolitan future, where same sort of things about urbanization, university education getting up to 50%, diversity, increased diversity, all those types of things, all pointed towards a more open future. And then we had Brexit and Trump, immediately afterwards. And it's kind of this question of, is this hinge point coming? Is it just delayed? Or is there, so Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart had just written a book called Cultural Backlash, which is not so much, they are the people that came up with, particularly Inglehart, came up with this kind of long, silent revolution of values that we've had in the last 50, 60 years, where we've kind of been moving in this move towards self-expression values, where we're kind of much more open, much more liberal, and that's the kind of direction of change. But before this happened, and certainly after this happened, Inglehart in particular, detecting this cultural backlash, which is where people, older groups, older generations, this is very generational, not entirely, but very generational, where the cultural change has been too fast. And there is this backlash that this is not a unidirectional thing where you can actually just change entirely. And that's, they link it mostly to political things of the rise of authoritarian populism, but it applies just as much in cultural aspects. And that's what I'll be writing about more, is it isn't an ebb and flow. It's not a unidirectional thing. And I think that is, we've got so used to economic progress. We had got so used to economic progress being automatic, that every generation would do better than the last. And this sense of we're moving in this slow move towards this liberal, more open value set as that happens. And neither of those things are coming to pass. So I don't think we can assume that we're just not quite there yet with this hinge point and it's just around the corner. I think there's a risk looking at the generational data that it's always just around the corner where we'll get to this tipping point into a more liberal, open future. So, I mean, that's kind of very big picture, long-term point, I suppose, but really important, I think, for understanding now in the more immediate reactions is that we can't just sort of hold off and think it's just around the corner. And then this current generation of younger people will be in the ascendancy and in control, and then that will make it better. That's not quite how, that's not how these types of generational drifts happen.
And I suppose the reason I mention it is just because it's always important to remember that we shouldn't be taking things for granted, that things, yes, they're not perfect now, and yet we definitely have lots to celebrate, but really being mindful of how change does happen. And if we're not careful, and if we're not constantly making sure that we are talking about what the evidence suggests helps people in need, that things can also turn. And this is a really good time, I think, to bring in Spencer. We're so excited to have you, Spencer, with us today, joining us from the US.
Great to be here.
And obviously, Stephen Greenberg, you're a mathematician and entrepreneur, and the founder and CEO of SparkWave, a startup foundry that creates new software companies from scratch, designed to help solve big problems in the world, and one of the creators of Clearer Thinking, which offers numerous free tools to help you make better decisions and reduce biases. You've published various papers in applied math, machine learning, mental health, and social science. And I first came across your work, yes, quite a few years ago when we were setting up the center, and it's so fantastic. Some of the tools you've created as part of Clearer Thinking to really help people understand their biases. So I suppose, listening to Bobby and the arguments that he set out in his books, what are the things that you feel resonate, and what are the reflections that you would take away?
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here. And I'll just speak very briefly. And thank you very much for that great presentation, Bobby. I think you made a lot of fantastic points, and I'll just build on a few of them briefly. So just to start, I'll mention a little bit more about our work at Clearer Thinking, which is clearerthinking.org if you want to check it out. So we have about 30 free tools and training programs that cover topics like bias and decision-making, how to make good arguments, how to think about evidence, many of these other topics. And so if you want to go explore how your mind works, how you can do better, it's a good place to do that. And we discussed many of the topics that Bobby discussed in his presentation. One thing I just want to go into a little bit more is about political narratives, and how I think that one of the, as Bobby mentioned, there's kind of two big elements here. One is the way our own minds work and can mislead us. The other is the way others are actually actively trying to mislead us or have an incentive to mislead us. And so thinking about that second topic of political narratives, politicians very often have a strong interest in oversimplifying reality. They want to tell us a very neat and tidy story about, well, this is the problem in society, and I'm going to pass this regulation, and that's going to fix the problem. And that's how they get elected. And the reality is, as Ligia knows well, that the world is complex. To solve real problems in the real world, you have to understand this complexity and nuance and all the different intricacies of that topic. And so, just to take one example, suppose there's a tragic plane crash. Politicians are likely to try to leverage that to get attention, but perhaps these kinds of plane crashes are incredibly rare. And in fact, there's many more common problems. For example, health problems caused by obesity that people talk about way less, just because it's hard to get attention for them. It's hard to pass one piece of regulation that seems like it solves the problem. There's not a clear party to blame that that a politician can blame it on. So so I think that that's an important element here, just the incentive structures of politics and how that can create all kinds of problems. And then going back to the topic of nonprofits and this trade-off where you want to tell a great story so that you can get donors to give you money, but on the other hand, anyone can tell a great story, right? You can tell a great story to support a cause. You can tell a great story against the cause, because all a great story requires is one example, and you can pretty much find one example to support any proposition you want. So in my view, the only way, the ethical way to use stories is to actually start with high quality evidence. And only once you've developed the high quality evidence and you're confident in your conclusions, then you build a story around it and you find examples that support that. But if you go the other way, if you start with the story, then you're in big trouble, because you're probably going to be misled about what's really going on. And a really sad anecdote about that kind of supports that view is this idea that people wanted to help in very poor communities in Africa where women have to spend a lot of time pumping water. And they came up with this brilliant seeming idea where they would set up these merry-go-rounds that kids could play on that would pump the water. And the idea was, well, kids like to play on merry-go-rounds, and so the kids will benefit. And since they're already playing since they'll be playing anyway, might as well hook it up to water pumps, and then the people in the village won't have to spend so much time pumping water. Unfortunately, while this plan got tons of funding and a lot of excitement and press, it turned out that the kids didn't play on these merry-go-rounds long enough. And what that meant is that you had various people from the village, the adults, having to go around on the merry-go-round to get the water out of the ground, which is a lot harder than just using the water pumps. And this setup had actually prevented the regular pumps from working properly. So it ended up being a huge disaster and actually making people's lives worse. And so this goes to the idea of just, it's so important to not get lost in the narrative and the story, and to really start with what is true about the world, really look at the world in all of its complexity. And just on that topic, I just want to talk briefly about a thing that we created called the 10 Conditions for Change. And you can find it on our website, sparkwave.tech, so sparkwave.tech. The 10 Conditions for Change is a new behavior change framework that we created with the idea of helping people dig into a topic that's really difficult to understand about human behavior. Why do people do this, or how do we help people do that? And try to break down kind of systematically what the different possible causes for the lack of that positive behavior could be, and pinpoint what might actually work to solve it. And we also on that website have a little behavior change search engine, so you can actually search for different behavior change strategies. We have hundreds of behavior change strategies we've indexed on there. But just to give you a brief sense of how we approach this topic, how we really try to help people understand really the nuance and complexity of human behavior and not oversimplify it. The way we break it up is we think about a positive behavior. Like, let's say you want to get people to exercise every day. Well, we start with a decision phase, right? People have to think about what they're eating and make a decision to eat differently, right? So that's the decision phase. Once you get through the decision phase, then we get to the action phase, where people have to take a series of actions across time. Maybe they have to pick out what kind of exercise they want to do. Maybe they have to buy some equipment or get a gym membership. Then they have to actually, exercise on Monday and exercise on Tuesday and exercise on Wednesday and so on. And that leads you finally to what we call the continuation phase, which is that people have to think it's not good enough to just do this behavior, 7 days. You have to continue this up for a long time. And so any of these conditions that used to be met might stop being met. So you have to keep things up. Basically, that's the continuation phase. And then the way that we break that down is that, so we've got these three phases: the decision phase, the action phase, and the continuation phase. And then each of them, we've got different conditions that if they're met, it's very likely the behavior will occur. So the idea is, if the behavior is not occurring, you can try to pinpoint which of these conditions is not met. And so in the decision phase, we've got three conditions. The person has to consider the behavior, they have to desire to engage in the behavior, and they have to intend to engage it, right? So you need to consider it, because if you've never thought about going to the gym, you're probably not going to do it. You need to desire it, because if you actually have no interest in going to the gym, you're probably not going to do it. And desire comes in two flavors. There's intuitive, like, oh, I really want to eat that piece of cake. And then there's a reflective desire, which is, I've weighed the pros and cons, and after thinking about it, I've decided it's worth it to go to the gym. And then you have to intend to engage in the behavior, because sometimes we might say, well, I really should go to the gym, but I don't have time right now. I'm too busy. I'll think about it later. I'll put it off. So that's the decision phase. And then next, that takes us to the action phase. In the action phase, we have 6 conditions that you need to try to meet to get the actions to occur. The first is that somebody needs to remember to perform the action, right? If you forget to go to the gym, you're not going to do it. You need to believe that attempting the action will help you achieve your goal, right? If someone says, well, if I go to the gym, I'm not actually going to be healthier, I'm not actually going to be fitter, well, that's, they're going to block them going to the gym. Third, you need to actually choose to do that action over other available actions that you could do at that moment, right? If you decide to play video games instead of going to the gym, well, you're not going to end up at the gym. And then the last 3 are that you have to know how to perform the action, like you have to know where the gym is, you have to know how to do the exercises. Second to last is you have to have the needed resources and permission. So let's say you can't afford to go to the gym, well, that's going to be a problem. And finally, you have to have any skills and traits needed to perform the action, right? If someone is injured, maybe they can't actually do the exercises. So that's kind of how we think about behavior change in this complex, nuanced world, is trying to look at all those conditions, try to pinpoint which ones are not met, and then use that to help us really try to deeply understand the problem. Oh, Ligia, I
Thank
can't hear
you.
you actually. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yes, that's really helpful. And one of the questions that came to mind, I guess, is how do you apply that to, I suppose, a particular field where people, they know that maybe sometimes the heat of the moment, they can find it really difficult to detach themselves from the emotion of the situation. Say, for instance, the evidence suggests that workers can't really predict outcomes. So we should probably be trying with everyone. So this came out from a large study of an intervention called Housing First that's very well evidenced. And one of the things that's very little talked about is that the workers, allocating people to different types of intervention couldn't really predict who would sustain and who wouldn't. And yet many of our systems are predicated on the assumption that the workers do know what's going to happen to people. So how do we build that uncertainty into some of these models as well? Is that something that you've been asked to consider ever?
Yeah, it's a great question. It actually reminds me a lot of some of Daniel Kahneman's work with the Israeli military, where he was trying to figure out how do they decide who should be a soldier, who should be a leader, who should be in different positions in the military. And when he arrived there as a young psychologist, they already had some systems in place. For example, I believe they had an exercise where the soldiers would have to work together to hold this really heavy log and like push it over a wall, something like that. And people would watch them and decide who would make a good leader by saying, well, who's taking charge? Who's the person standing in front of everyone else or giving orders to the others? But the reality is, while this was incredibly convincing, if you watched this exercise, you'd be fairly convinced about who would make a good leader. The evidence suggested that, in fact, this had almost no correlation whatsoever to being a good leader. And it was probably due to just more factors, like who's more social or extroverted or who's just louder or whatever. So what Daniel Kahneman did is he said, okay, well, we really need to design a system from the ground up that actually helps predict the thing of interest. And then we have to validate it. And so I think it's very similar, is that a lot of times we have intuitions about things, and sometimes those intuitions are very accurate. Like many people are quite good at reading someone they just met and getting a feel for what is this person like. On the other hand, we often have bad intuitions. For example, in hiring, people tend to way overtrust their intuition and how good a candidate will be based on a short interview with the candidate. They tend to read into factors like how likable the person is, how sociable the person is, which are the factors that are easy to see, and not read into the factors that are hard to see, like, well, okay, but what is this person's work ethic going to be like, or how conscientious is this person? Like, it's tough to see in a half an hour conversation. And so I think the key is not to throw out intuition altogether, but to consider what things is intuition reliable for and what is it not reliable for. And then for the things it's not reliable for, you have to kind of do what Daniel Kahneman did, which is you have to build a set of criteria. Okay, what are we actually trying to evaluate? What do we think the factors are that actually are likely to predict this thing? Then you have people score on those factors. So let's say you knew poverty was one risk factor, right? So, okay, if you have evidence of that, then you can build that into the process that people can use in their predictions. But instead of having them just go with their gut, you have them kind of break down the problem, estimate these different components that are known through evidence to predict the thing of interest, and then you can compile them up back together. So one of the really interesting things about Daniel Kahneman's work is, so the interviewers who are used to making these scores were very frustrated with him because he'd kind of systematized their process so much that it had taken the creativity out of it. So what he said to them is, okay, well, go through my systematic process of evaluating these people's potential. But when you're done, you can still use your intuition. So I want you to, at the very end, once you've evaluated all these different components that we've shown actually relate to the thing we're trying to predict, then you can use your gut. Then you can use your intuition to create a score, and then we'll average them together, the more objective score and the subjective score. And it turns out that worked really well. So it wasn't that their intuition had no value, but they had to first go through the exercise of thinking of all the factors that are known to predict the thing. And once they'd gone through that, that actually helped their intuition get better.
That's, yes, really interesting, and a good point to start asking some of the questions from the audience. So we have one from Sally Cross, and she asks, do you think we can harness our new perception of social isolation from lockdown to increase empathy for those experiencing homelessness? Bobby, can we?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think there's so much going on in people's lives right now, and we've traveled in such a huge distances in terms of our reactions to this. We've been doing a tracking study sort of every couple of weeks among the public, and enormous swings in people's views. Very kind of the change that we've seen has been enormous. So just some of my background's obviously more political polling. And I'd never seen figures like this at the beginning of the crisis, where we had this enormous sense of in it together. It was like you had 9 in 10 people agreeing with the lockdown measures, and 7 in 10 of them strongly agreeing with the lockdown measures when they came in. And you never get 7 in 10 Brits strongly agreeing with anything. It's just the only other thing that works for is the NHS, really, which gives you some clue of why we were so united on it, because it was framed very much in terms of protecting the NHS. So we had this enormous moment of that sense of in it together, driven by both that sense of protecting the NHS and our great emotional attachment to that, but also a very strong sense of personal risk and risk to people that we our loved ones. So it was this real blend of that emotional reaction and this personal threat and personal interest. But since then, we've kind of really already drifted back to quite close to normal politics, where you're starting to see party political divisions in people's support for the government, people's support for measures, are massively more aligned now to which party you support, which it just wasn't at the time. So normal politics has exerted itself in a very short period of time. So I think, unfortunately, that applies to lots of our kind of reactions in those very heated moments, is that we do forget. This goes back to the rosy retrospection point, is we do let go and forget those feelings very, very quickly. I have to say as well, just one more positive point, is I've been doing a lot of the analysis, and then been asked a lot about the media about pro-social behaviours during the lockdown, and it was enormous. I mean, it still is enormous. People helping each other out you get 6 in 10 people offering help to others, half of people saying that they've had help from others, and that's kind of continuing. It's drifting down a bit now as people go back, but it's still there. But the key point on that is what it highlights to me is when you look back to pre-COVID days and you look back to the Community Life Survey and how many people were helping each other before the crisis, it was always like 4 in 10 people doing some sort of informal volunteering. This is not an unusual behavior. And that is the key point, is that this is not on pro-social behavior, helping each other out. That's kind of a default position for a large part of the population, not something that's just brought out in crisis. And we need to remember that, is it's like the media kind of framing it as a special moment in time. We'll never get that back. But on that kind of pro-social behavior, helping each other out, that's more a default than a peak, an unusual peak. And that's the more positive message to take for that. How can we harness that default altruistic tendency that lots and lots of people have?
And Spencer, that links nicely to another question that's come up from Angiola Carr. Can you say more about how homelessness is bad for society as a whole? And this became very obvious when COVID hit, but how can our focus be kept on our interconnectivity and interdependency? So certainly I know this happened in many cities in the US. There were some exceptions as well, for sure. How would you say we might be able to use exactly the types of tools that you've been, developing as a way of like Bobby is saying, building on that natural solidarity that does exist in neighborhoods and communities?
Yeah, well, one thing I think about is that humans are naturally quite pro-social. There's the occasional sociopathic person or low empathy narcissist, but for the most part, people really are pro-social and they want others to do well. Of course, they want to do themselves well even more, but still they do want others to do well. And I think the key is just how do you leverage that as much as possible. And, unfortunately, a kind of quirk of the human mind is that we want to help those that are most similar to ourselves. That's an unfortunate thing. And it cuts across many different aspects. People want to help those near them physically. They also want to help those they can relate to. They want to help those of the same ideology and so on. And so I think one way to help leverage people's pro-social instincts is actually to show similarities that people may not have realized, right? So if you can show someone who is homeless, who the person identifies with, that maybe grew up where they did, or seems similar to them, that I think those kind of actions can help make it so people actually care more. Because unfortunately, we have this really strong bias to help those most similar to us, and this probably goes way back to our evolutionary, origins. And the world's come a long way. I think today more than ever, people are willing to help someone who's totally different from them, who's on the other side of the world. But still, I think one of the most effective ways to get people to care is to show similarities.
And as we start wrapping up, Bobby, what would you say when it comes to finding a way forward, knowing what we know about the lack of evidence-informed communications a lot of the time? And when we have so many stereotypes and so many misconceptions that came from the sector itself, from the experts, what would you say are the most, important things to bear in mind? Say the top 3 things we should carry on doing, and things that we should stop doing. In particular, when we know from the limited evidence we have, to make matters even worse, that busting myths often doesn't work, because people tend to remember the myth more than the reality.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a decent challenge. Thanks, Lydia. Look, one thing just on that backfire effect, which is what you're talking about, where you can inadvertently reinforce myths by trying to burst them, by reminding them. We have to be really careful there. I think this is. I'll just wrap it up in one point. I think maybe because it is. You have to be really careful there, because that was based on just a small amount of evidence from particular types of issues. And particularly whether it's very emotionally or tribally driven. So that kind of backfire effect, as people talk about it, where you use facts and actually reinforces the myth, was mostly around weapons of mass destruction and gun violence in the US. And lots of people have tried to replicate it, and it doesn't work with lots of different issues. You don't have the same effects if you use facts and people believe the opposite and believe the myth. That's really important. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, because we can almost get too scared of facts. When now we've kind of come in this big cycle where we think actually all we can do is use emotion and connect to people in an emotional way. And that's too simplistic a view of how humans work, how the brain works, and how these misperceptions are created and reinforced. So the real message for this, the real messages from this, from my perspective, are: remember, it's a system of delusion. This is not just one thing or the other. It is about that interaction between things. That sounds scary, but it's not. Once you start to break it down, you can start to think, how do you interject in that? And then, but also remember that facts are not useless for people. This is not a one-size-fits all approach, and it's not that emotion is the only thing that works with all individuals in all things. The real thing, final point then in those 3, is that the thing that's most effective is if you can blend story and narrative with that factual reality-based view of the world for people. That's the most powerful. We've swung too far in a pendulum that's gone from everything's about facts, and we just tell people the truth and they'll make up their minds, to it's only about emotion and you just got to tell these stories and that's how you engage with people. Or actually it's a blend. You need to blend those 2 things effectively, and that should be our objective. Not just because it's effective, because morally that's the correct approach, or else otherwise we just end up telling stories to counter other stories. We sort of lose all sight of reality, and that's very dangerous. Oh, you're muted. Oh, still muted. Yep.
Got it. Thank you so much, Bobby and Spencer. That's a great point where to end the discussion. But everyone, buy the book if you don't have a copy already. And not just Bobby's old book that we're discussing today, but a new one also coming up. And visit the Clearest Thinking website. Such interesting tools for everyone to use. So there's many myths that surround homelessness and those experiencing it. As the problem in the UK increases over months and years to come, we would do well to tackle this, and that are false assumptions. It will definitely just help the work that we're all doing. So a great way to end week 3 of the festival. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your questions throughout. But do remember that we still have a session this afternoon at 2 o'clock. So do join us for that. It's about linked administrative data, the opportunity that presents, a really powerful tool, and the session will be chaired by Dr. Emma Gordon, the director of the Administrative Data Research UK, and she'll be joined by a great panel of data linkage experts to discuss what the options are. So remember as well to keep the conversation going online using the hashtag CHIFest2020. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Bobby and Spencer. We will see you all very soon. Take care.